we go. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Ken, for that very nice introduction, and thank you to OCEPP for inviting me to participate with you today. It's been a long time since I've addressed a group of engineers, although I would like to confess that in part of my career, I spent 4 years in the Ministry of Transportation, so you can imagine that as a sociologist and an urban planner, it was a little bit of a cultural stretch, at least in many respects. As Ken mentioned, I'm going to bring the perspective of a policy practitioner to the topic of decoding the policy practice, but also a policy practitioner who now teaches graduate students in public policy at the U of T. And I think much of what I say will pick up on themes that have already been landed by both speakers this morning. So in my brief time, I thought I'd try to deconstruct the policy process. Some of it may seem a bit basic to you, but my understanding in talking to Catherine and others who are organizing the conference that this was to be a back to basics sort of conference. And I want to speak briefly to 5 points, and then mostly I'm very interested in hearing your questions. So what is public policy? At a high level take on the nature of the policy process, the bit of discussion on the policy landscape or the policy space as it's been referred to this morning, or the policy context, the context in which policy process unfolds, how do issues get framed, who are the players, etc. A couple of comments on having impact in a policy process, influence and leadership, and then a few concluding comments on education. I'm going to talk about education, but engineering and public policy. So what is public policy? I think this audience has a pretty good idea of it, but I always like to take a very straightforward explanation of policy, which is, as say on the slide, I see policy as a direction or a course of action that addresses either problems or levers opportunities that are available. And it's in areas that we as a community or as a society find problematic. So I know that's not an academic, it's definitely not an academic definition, but it's one that makes sense to me because it focuses on policy as action. It focuses on policy as directed to solving problems or optimizing opportunities. And it also implies choice. And in the sense that there can be different courses of action. And I think that's what makes a lot of the policy process very challenging and in some cases problematic, as we've already started to hear today. And I guess it was Dawn who mentioned wicked problems. I wasn't going to use that word, and I'm not because Dawn has used it, but that's what public policy to me is about complex problems facing us as a public. And by complex, I'm thinking of, in many cases, the contributing factors are myriad, or they're not understood. The research or the evidence is not there, or it's contradictory, or is inconclusive. Could be complex because the proposed remedies to particular problems are work at cross purposes. Lots of people have different views about what needs to be done. And also part of the complexity is that frequently policy choices can produce unintended consequences that you had never imagined would happen. So all of those are examples of, to me, of complex policy problems. I've put a list on the slide. You all will have your own list. These are areas where I think science and technology really matter. They're critical, and it's often hard to keep that focus in looking at these. But I think the main point I want to make about complexity, and particularly where engineering and science come in, is that frequently on policy issues, it's hard to know what the problem is, and therefore really difficult to know what the potential range of solutions can be. And I think you can also see from this list that my definition of policy is quite different from maybe some of your discussions about regulatory policy affecting the practice of engineering in the province of Ontario. And I understand you're getting to that later today, but this morning, certainly I'm going to be talking about the broader public policy. Policy process, well, we certainly heard a lot this morning already about that, so some of this will sound a bit redundant, but here's my take. I think there's 4 things to understand about the nature of the policy process in this country. First, as has already been established this morning, and I know you know, is that policy making is a decision-making process. So it is about making concrete choices. Usually they're tough because it's about the allocation of scarce resources, time, money, regulatory authority, etc., delegated authority, across competing priorities. Because it involves options, it involves trade-offs. And depending on the trade-off, whatever trade-off is made, different groups and individuals will be affected differently, which is obviously something to be considered in the public policy process. I can remember a couple of years ago all the debate around whether or not Ontario should harmonize its sales tax regulatory regime, and a lot of that was a discussion about winners and losers in the current system and in the then current system and the one we have now. The second point on the slide, I think both Steve and Don have spoken to very eloquently, and it's, in my words, because we live in a democracy, the policy process is not a linear or a rational or a technocratic process, and I think you've had lots of examples already of that today. It is what social scientists call a deliberative process or a political process, in that it involves many players. So there's citizens, organized stakeholders and interest groups, experts, public, private, and community-based institutions, elected officials, and bureaucracies, all constituting the policy space. So there's many voices, many competing interests and ideas. The specifics of a policy process that sorts all this out do vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and I think one of the questions that was asked of Don started to get at that. But the policy process that determines which problems, but fundamentally the policy process, regardless of its variations, determines which problems get put at the top of a government's agenda, how they're framed, and what the acceptable range of solutions is considered to be. The third point that I think is important to understand about the policy process is that it mixes up what and how questions. And while it would be nice to have a linear process, that's not the way it works. Frequently, ideally, if you were to design a policy process, you would want you'd want the discussion to start out about what are we trying to achieve, what are the objectives, what would success look like. But frequently, policy debates begin around the choice of means or the mechanism that's going to be used to meet some sort of policy objective. The current examples on the fiscal front, I think, that hopefully you will smile about, are casinos as a method of revenue generation, which has been a hot topic in the GTA for, seems like years, but anyway, recent months. And this week's discussion on best ways to finance transit, where there's all kinds of ideas, but it's, and very, the debate has shifted from should we have transit to how do we finance it. But the transit debate, I think, is always a terrific one of showing how the policy debate flips around between what are we trying to achieve and how are we going to do it, and what results are we after. The last point on the slide is I think, an important feature of the policy process, and it goes addresses one of the questions that was asked in the last session. The policy process is cyclical, and that's largely because the electoral process is cyclical, every 4 years or less. A rule of thumb that is used in government is that tough decisions are usually made early on in a government's mandate. So the window of opportunity for advancing policy ideas really lasts only about 18 months from an election. The rest of the time, the rest of the mandate is spent on implementation and execution, and hopefully thinking about what might be possible in the next term. But if you're seeking to influence policy, you have to understand the cyclical nature of the process. You have to understand where the government is in its process, and you need to figure out how to engage wherever it is in the process, whether it's policy development or policy delivery, or thinking a bit longer term for a next agenda. There's been a lot of discussion about this morning, the political landscape or the policy space. The main point of this slide is that, and I know you know this, is that the policy process does not unfold in a vacuum. It actually unfolds in a very dynamic context where many factors come into play. Many of them have already been mentioned. I know I've already mentioned that with many voices and interests out there, the playing field for public policy can get very crowded indeed. So there are numerous priorities that compete for a politician's decision-making time and attention. Issues get shaped by politics and by the political timetable, as Steve spoke to very well this morning. Policy process is shaped as well by the media. So my caution would be to never underestimate the influence of the media in terms of being able to help you advance your agenda or knock you off it. And that's a big change I've seen during my career in the public service and now, is that the 24-hour news cycle and the social media and the powers of the internet have really changed the dynamic of the policy landscape incredibly. Many more participants, many more ideas. There are always overarching factors that affect government decision-making, like the economy and government's fiscal capacity. Both of those certainly affect the timing of decision-making, or the sequencing or the staging. And there are for government, there are always practical constraints on action, whether that's money, legal problems, constitutional risks, stakeholder communications, etc. So in many ways, context is all. And my main message here is that you strive to understand that and work within it in advancing policy ideas and ways to implement them. The policy process is a search for options that, and policy decision-making is focused on trying to find options that will align the variety of competing interests and voices as much as possible. And that speaks to Dawn's point about the importance of engagement and of building trust and public support for options. There, as I've mentioned, there always is more than one option, and government tends now to, it has an array of tools it can use to implement policy, both can act directly, although it doesn't do that much anymore, and indirect tools that cause others to act. Excuse me. Allergy season. And the criteria that government uses to evaluate these courses of action go beyond the technical to include the doability and the feasibility. So, for example, in energy or environmental policy, in addition to obviously critical technical considerations that go, oops, I drank someone else's water, that go into making policy, governments also have to look at capacity of the delivery chain. This is my own glass. I got two glasses. Only one's mine. My example then should be on public health, right? So on energy and environmental policy, which I know is near and dear to many of your hearts, in addition to the technical aspect considerations, which are considerable, governments have to look at things like, is there a delivery, what's the delivery chain going to be? Is there the capacity out there to deliver a new way of doing energy? They have to figure out who's responsible for what. They have to get the lines of governance and accountability right so that all the problems don't come back on government itself. There's definitely, especially in those areas, government needs assurance that all the risks have been appropriately, the relevant risks have been appropriately identified and mitigated, or there's contingency plans in place if the unexpected happens. Governments also have to be able to explain their choices to the public. And I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. So given that, if that definition of policy, of public policy, and my description of the policy process unfolding in a kind of complicated landscape makes any sense to you, how can you have impact? Again, I've got 4 points here, which all boil down to basically, to have influence, you have to get out there and play in traffic, as one of my former deputy ministers always urged me to do. There are many points of engagement in the policy process. There was a question about how do you get engaged, and that's a very good question. Maybe we can talk a bit about that in this session as well. There are informal and formal mechanisms. You need to learn about those. There's the useful notion of policy workup, which means all the behind the scenes and in front of the scenes type of activity that goes into research and option development and opinions, et cetera, into a decision making. So whether it's consultations or task forces or working groups or meetings or innovative research, breakthrough research, that can all be part of the policy workup. And certainly I would think that engineers, you as an engineering profession, would have a great opportunity to tap into those various processes. Frequently there's an intergovernmental dimension. It's hard to think of a policy issue where there's not an intergovernmental dimension. So I think the trick is to find an on-ramp into all of that. Don mentioned a little bit about a role of evidence and data, and I just wanted to underline that remains critical in a rigorous policy process, and especially around evidence relating to science and technological capacity, I think are very hard for the layperson to understand. And but it's critical that they be brought into the discussion. But the evidence has to be brought forward in a way that it can be assessed as to, can meet the tests of feasibility that I just referenced, whether it's fitting the context, whether there's a delivery capacity there, whether the accountability can be clear and aligned, whether it can be financed, and whether the risks are, whether an acceptable level of risk is involved. Just a word about risk. Some of you may be familiar with the view that risk equals not simply the hazard, but also outrage, which references the technical and rational part of assessing risk. You know, its probability and its likely impact, but adds the human side, so that risk is in, I guess, the eye of the beholder in many ways. Examples I can think of are the real or perceived debate around the real or perceived risks in to public health with excuse me, genetically modified foods, or the location of power plants and wind turbines. I raise this point about risk as having a human dimension because it underlines the importance of communications and communication skills as part of, and someone asked a question about skills, as part of the, as being able to, as part of the policy process. And by communication skills, I'm thinking of the skills of telling a compelling story based on evidence and based on plain language. So ability to translate research and science into plain language is critical, but also to put that into a narrative that helps persuade people of your point of view, or helps you see your way through to a set of common objectives when you're in a negotiating situation. So being comfortable with public speaking in a traditional sense, but also understanding that storytelling is very much part of public speaking, and also there's the using the world of media, social media and internet to build broader understanding and acceptance of the ideas that you're proposing. The last point on this slide talks about collaboration. I think we handled that, that was handled quite well in Don Lenihan's session, but I'm happy to come back to that. I would just add to it that the tools of modern government, because they're less direct delivery, really do involve different perspectives and different players. So the ability to work out and across and up and down in a very flexible manner is critical in terms of developing collaborative approaches and new partnerships. For any profession, not just engineers. In my career in the public service, I worked with many very technically oriented parts of the public service. Transportation was one, natural resources was another, finance was another, social services. Again, all people in their own professions are highly skilled and very dedicated and committed, but often don't understand that that can put blinkers on terms, and so in working across, you have to be able to be comfortable operating from the base of your discipline, but understanding that there are other equally valid disciplinary approaches, and together you're looking for something that's that is interdisciplinary and focused on commonalities rather than differences. Last slide, engineering and public policy. I hope my remarks are a little bit helpful in helping you decode the policy process. Because I'm now in the education business, I thought I should say something about education for engagement in the policy process. And I know there's a number of students in the today, and I would think if you're engineering students, you certainly, probably at whatever university you're at, you have a great opportunity to learn more in a formal way about the public policy process. I know U of T, McMaster all have some version of an engineering and public policy program. I'm sure other engineering faculties do as well. Carnegie Mellon in the States, of course, has quite an ambitious engineering and public policy program at the master and PhD levels. So there's some terrific opportunities to formally learn for those of you who are still in the formal education system. Your professional associations like the PEO and like OCEPP and today's forum are critical opportunities for learning about the policy process and for starting to build linkages just within your own profession on common issues that then might allow you to lever that into other discussions. An organization that you may or may not know about that I thought might be a good place for to talk, maybe more of the not technical aspects of policy, but actually the how policy gets done, is the Institute of Public Administration of Canada. And some of you may already be members, but that's the IPAC is the organization that involves all levels of government, and it brings public servants and the private sector and government together. And they're organized regionally, so there's lots of regional workshops you can go to and forums, and there's annual conferences and professional development conferences and that sort of thing. I know it was early in my career, I found it an invaluable organization to help learn more about this thing called public policy and how governments make decisions. And finally, I just wanted to say, because I think most of the audience here are already in their jobs and in the community, and so the only suggestion I can make is that you find ways to look outward, to take your engineering expertise and your research and what you know from the world of research, or if you're in the world of research, your research, into the broader policy forum. Whether it's energy and environmental systems, or information and communications technology policy, risk analysis and communication, technical innovation and R&D policy. That's sort of a starter list of areas where I thought engineers have a very valuable contribution to make in a bigger way. Or whether it's on more pragmatic things like in Ontario, the implementation of recent budget priorities around infrastructure investment, support for entrepreneurship, even youth job strategy. Those are all maybe starting points for those of you who are looking for issues to get involved in. There's some ideas. And with that, I will end my comments and turn it over to Marcia, and I think we want to take questions at the end. So thank you very much for your attention.